Now, I hate to say it, but it's true. Various and sundry government people have lied repeatedly about flying saucers. I don't mean once or twice. They made a habit of it. The man with his hand swearing to tell the truth, that's President Eisenhower in the background on the right, is Secretary of the Air Force Donald Quarles. And in 1955, October, a press release was issued about the largest study ever done for the Air Force about flying saucers. Now, it was kind of strange. The release appeared all over the place. It didn't say who did the work. It didn't give the title of the report, Project Blue Book Special Report number 14. If they had, surely some newsman would have said, what do you mean 14? What happened to 1 through 13? We've never heard anything about them. Well, they were all classified as it happened. They weren't going to say anything about that. And of course, by not giving the name of the people that did the work, Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio, there's no way a reporter could get back to the original people to ask questions. You know, give us some more data. Now, what's important is what he said, or in some ways what he didn't say. This is his quote. This is right out of the press release that went out October 25th, 1955. On the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. I feel certain that even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been obtained. Very straightforward. There's really nothing to this stuff, and don't worry about it. Now, the only problem is it's a total lie. This is the press release, and the quote is right here. Right here, rather. Now, here's the data. Categorization. The only ones we're really interested in are the unknowns. All the final decisions had to be approved of by 4 scientists working for Battelle. Any 2 could list it as anything else. Aircraft, balloon, astronomical, that sort of thing. The unknowns, 21.5%. That's not 3% rounded off by any stretch of the imagination. Furthermore, the next to the last category is insufficient information. By definition, if there wasn't enough data available about a sighting, it absolutely could not be listed as an unknown. Instead, it had to be listed as insufficient information. That's not what the Secretary of the Air Force said. Incidentally, they did a quality evaluation of all the sightings. The better the quality, the more likely to be unexplainable. They did a cross-comparison between the unknowns and the knowns on the basis of 6 different characteristics. The probability that the unknowns are just misknowns, less than 1%. And he had the gall to lie straightforwardly, and no newsman. I've looked at a lot of articles about this. Nobody followed up to say that's baloney. It's no wonder we're so ill-informed. There's Carl Sagan. Now I have to give Carl credit. He's done more than anybody else to get people excited about the notion of extraterrestrial intelligence over the years. I mean, who else has appeared on Johnny Carson so many times? You do remember who Johnny Carson was. I knew Carl pretty well. We were in the same classes at the University of Chicago in the physics department for 3 years. We grew up in adjacent towns in New Jersey. Thank you. I grew up in Linden. He grew up in Rahway, which is right next door. I'm 4 months older than he was. And here's the strange statement that he made. The reliable cases are uninteresting, and the interesting cases are unreliable. Unfortunately, there are no cases that are both reliable and interesting. Well, that sounds pretty definitive. He actually said it more than once. He doesn't give a reference for that statement. The reason is very straightforward. There is no reference for it because it's totally false. That quality evaluation said the more reliable the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. And Carl provided testimony to a congressional hearing in which the data is in the report, but apparently he didn't read it. You expect scientists to give references for claims like that. There's plenty of data that should be looked at before you open up your mouth. Carl isn't the only one who's done that, but was pretty influential. His papers just went to the Library of Congress. I forget, 700,000 materials, 700 cases of stuff, huge amount of material. And I'll give him credit. The first time I spoke at Cornell, he was there. We had met beforehand, and he agreed we wouldn't get into it at the lecture. The second time he was busy, but I was at his house that afternoon. And it was a cordial conversation. I did begin challenging him to a debate, then I found out he was dying of cancer, and it didn't seem to be the right thing to do, to push for a debate. So I wish he were still around, because I still wanted to debate him. But, it's like the rest of the SETI community. Don't bother me with the facts. They'd say there is no evidence, there is no data. We'll deal with a couple of specifics along those lines in a minute. But Carl had a lot of influence on other people, including on the press. If Carl said something, that was good enough for many people. Whoops. Come on. Yeah. Now, one of the remarkable things that happened for those of us with a serious professional interest in flying saucers was the receipt of a roll of film at the end of 1984, in which there was a briefing for President-elect Eisenhower, dated in November 1952, about Operation Majestic 12. And in this briefing, 8 pages as it came, form of a roll of film, no return address, but the city was Albuquerque. My colleague in California had it. In this briefing, it states that President Truman established a group called Operation Majestic 12 in September 1947. This is after Roswell. Mentioning Roswell and the bodies that was found and the wreckage that was found, and that this group was established to deal with that. And it named the members of the group. Pretty special. 3 of them, at one later, were directors of Central Intelligence. There's several generals, admirals, a really sharp group of people. And it didn't take much work to find that 11 of the 12 had high-level security clearances. You could tell from their jobs during the war and right after that. But there was one strange one. Dr. Donald Menzel. Now, he was known as the biggest UFO debunker in town for many, many years. Wrote 3 anti-UFO books. And Dr. Menzel was a professor of astronomy at Harvard. You obviously don't need a high-level security clearance to teach astronomy at Harvard, or any place else for that matter. How could he be part of such a group that knew all about a crash saucer, alien bodies, all this sort of stuff? And Operation Majestic Cloud was accountable only to the president. Very high-class group. Well, I didn't like Dr. Menzel while he was alive. I changed my mind after I found out what I'll tell you in just a minute. I had one run-in with him at Harvard. I was giving a talk to an engineering alumni group. I had no idea whether they were promoting my lecture outside the organization. So I got there early and I called Dr. Menzel, gave my name. Oh, I know all about you. Oh, you saw my congressional testimony next to yours? No, I've seen letters and memos about you. And I just found out 2 weeks ago what that meant. My colleague, Kathleen Martin, who's back there, was at the American Philosophical Society Library, looking at papers from Dr. Condon, who did the big study, and Dr. Menzel, and so forth. And Condon had sent copies of my letters to him, to Menzel. You can't be a scientist and believe in flying saucers, he said. I left. What else are you going to do for something so ridiculous? He got angry. Started ranting. I said, Dr. Menzel, I didn't call to argue with you. I called out of courtesy because I didn't know whether they had promoted my lecture outside, their group. I just wanted to invite you, told them it would be at 8 o'clock in such and such a building. Oh, well, of course I won't be there. So I told the story that night at the lecture, just so they would know that I wasn't afraid of the good Dr. Menzel. Well, I had a couple of pieces of information that made me scratch my head. One of them was that he was the subject of a loyalty hearing. Remember Senator McCarthy? Communist under every bed. If it's a big one, there are 2 communists under there, Why would Menzel have a loyalty hearing in which they were going to take away his clearance? Why did he have a security clearance? There are 2 special issues of Sky and Telescope magazine dedicated to Dr. Menzel. The first one when he died, and the second one the 100th anniversary of his birth. And in neither one of these is there any mention of any classified work by Dr. Menzel. Well, I had a piece of a letter sent from the attorney's office who represented Menzel at this hearing to another member, Dr. Vannevar Bush, in which he was thanked for his assistance to getting Menzel freed, if you will, not guilty. He was able to keep his clearance. So I called the legal firm, one of these old Boston big-time legal firms, and they said, yeah, there's 1,100 pages about this at the Harvard Archives. Now, all the members of this group were conveniently dead when we got this roll of film, so you couldn't talk to any of them. But I called the Harvard Archives, had to get permission from 3 different people to look at his papers, Menzel's, and got a grant from the Fund for the UFO Research, and went there. And I had looked at some of his UFO stuff at the Philosophical Society Library, and knew about it at the University of Denver. And I didn't know where to start. There was nothing that said UFOs, but there was a file that said JFK. That seems strange to me. Why would Dr. Menzel, a Harvard professor, be talking about JFK? Well, it turned out JFK was on the board of overseers at Harvard, and he chose as his area of interest astronomy, and he worked with Don Menzel. And as I looked at the file, I was totally astonished. There is Menzel writing to JFK in 1960, when JFK was running for president, saying, there's one area where I may be able to be of assistance to you. And that is with regard to the National Security Agency. You know, NSA, no such agency, never says anything, Mr. Snowden's employed. And that shook me up. I've had a longer continuous association with them, 30 years, this is in 1960, of anybody in the country. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. This is writing to the president-elect, you understand. They knew each other on the first name basis, but that came as a real shocker. And I had to get permission, as I said, from 3 different people to look at his papers. And I read his unpublished autobiography. Turns out he'd been working in cryptography, code breaking and stuff, for many, many years. Not only did he work for the NSA, but all kinds of other agencies like the CIA, like the FBI, all kinds of high-level security employers that he did consulting work for. So it was a real revelation to me and to everybody else in the UFO community. Because I had people saying, Stan, you wrote an article saying the double life of Donald Menzel. He couldn't have led a double life. Well, I'll give you 3 names: Burgess, Philby, and McLean. These were 3 Russian spies working for British intelligence for many years. That's leading a double life. And many of the people around Harvard didn't know about Menzel's hearings. I found a couple of people that did, fortunately. That was a real big thing for me to find that information about him. And people who disputed me, none of them have gone to Harvard to look at the papers. I quoted from them, but it didn't matter. Don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. But that was a real breakthrough for me. I began to develop an appreciation for Donald Menzel. He served his country well. He was head of the Naval Reserve Group in Cambridge, Massachusetts for many, many years. He served in the Navy during the war. There's a book out talking about his contributions to cryptology. He really was appreciated, but he knew how to keep his mouth shut. And I'd met his wife, and she didn't know anything about his classified activities, she said. And I've had people tell me, all those guys would have all, there's a list of 12, would all have told their wives what they were doing, wouldn't they? No. I had a clearance for 14 years. I never told my wife anything classified. A, it would be breaking the rules, and B, I can't control what she inadvertently says somewhere where there are other people. Loose lips sink ships, you know, you've heard of that? It's true. You don't tell your wife classified. Anybody here who had a security clearance? Oh, a few. Do you agree with me that you don't tell your wife anything classified? You do? Oh, you agree? Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of those many misrepresentations by the nasty, noisy negativists. Anyway, I was very pleased to make the great discovery about Donald Menzel, even if some people don't appreciate it. Here's what he said in Physics Today. All non-explained sightings are from poor observers. And I know he had a copy of Blue Book Special Report 14 because he listed it in something you wrote. You see why you got to check and double check. And are people willing to lie? Yes. He was protecting security. Now, I'll give him credit for that. He wrote 3 anti-UFO books, which any college sophomore could have torn to pieces because he was so clever about pulling these explanations out of the sky, not supported by evidence or data. But they sound good. Now, something the press has never paid attention to. Project Blue Book was the Air Force group supposedly the only one concerned with UFOs. After Project Sign and Project Grudge, which were right after the war, and Blue Book was around from the early 50s till 1969. In early 1969, the University of Colorado study under Dr. Edward U. Condon was published. Scientific report on unidentified flying objects, 965 pages. And to give the press credit, I got my first copy from KDKA Pittsburgh, one of the old big radio and television stations. That's how I got started being a ufologist, really. Funny story. I had talked to guys at work about UFOs. When I had found that Blue Book Special Report 14 in that statement by Quarles, and saw the data, and he was clearly a liar, it made me angry, and I wanted to get to the bottom of this. So I joined a couple of UFO groups, APRO and NICAP, which don't exist, but I was doing all this quietly with my colleagues maybe, but certainly never publicly. Finally, Frank Edwards put out a book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business. Some of you are probably aware of that, in the mid-60s. And I moved to Indianapolis. I was 3 years here, 3 years there, 3 years there, until they cancel the program and you go someplace else. Not how I intended to spend my life, but that's the way it worked out. And finally, Frank gave me a copy of his book, and I called him and I said, Frank, I'm ready to go public. By this time I had moved to working for Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. Give me some names. You know everybody. He was on the board of NICAP, and he did know everybody. One of the names he gave me was the producer of a program called Contact at KDKA Pittsburgh. Great title for a program. And I called thinking that my credentials as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist in Pittsburgh would be gold-plated, and of course he'd want me on. What it boiled down to was, don't call us, we'll call you. But less than a month later, he called. Why? Because somebody had canceled at the last minute, and I didn't live too far from the station, so he called me at 6:30, would I do the 7 o'clock show? And I said yes. That was my first show. And I wasn't as good then as handling the nasty, noisy negativist as I am now, but somebody at work at Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab heard me on the show and asked if I'd speak to her book review club, which was reading Frank's book. That was my first lecture, was in her living room. I did the show several times, and I did other lectures, and it got started there. And I got lucky. One of 2 days in 3 years that I rode from downtown Pittsburgh to large Pennsylvania, small town where Westinghouse Astronuclear was. And I was working with a gal who was a PhD at Westinghouse. And I was lamenting the fact that I wanted to speak at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. She said, well, why don't you talk to the dean? I said, well, I talked to Dr. So-and-so, and he wasn't interested. She said, Stan, the dean's my husband. He's heard you on the radio. Give him a call. So I did, and we booked a date. It was funny. Last question he asked was, how much do you want to give a lecture? And the time was in the afternoon, which meant I'd have to take time off work. How about $100, figuring he'd knock me down to 50. This is back in 1967, you understand. Sold. Then he told me what he was paying the other people in the series, $1,600, $1,700, $1,500. The talk went extremely well. He wrote the agent through whom he had booked the other speakers, and they booked me at the Engineering Society of Detroit for $300 in expenses. Wow, I was in the big time. They were sold out 3 weeks in advance for 1,008 people for dinner and a talk. And there wasn't one negative question. And you better believe I got to respect the Engineering Society of Detroit, even though I normally buy Japanese cars these days. I was very impressed by their response. And I was giving a lot of talks, and I asked my boss, I need some rules of the game here. What can I do? What can't I do? I don't want to lose my clearance. I don't want to lose my job. I got a wife, kids, mortgage, you know. They came back to me with 3 rules. You can identify yourself as a Westinghouse nuclear physicist. You can say whatever you please on your time. But we'd like you to put a disclaimer at the beginning saying that the views you're about to hear are mine and mine alone and not those of my employer. Now, what more could you ask for? Well, I did ask for something more. I got a call from my colleague in Los Alamos. We both worked on radiation shielding for nuclear rocket reactor propulsion systems. And he said, Stan, how about speaking to our local American Nuclear Society section? Oh, I'd love to. No, I mean on an expense account, Stan. He's in Los Alamos, I'm in Pittsburgh. Well, I don't make those decisions, I'll ask management. I said, yes. I flew to Los Alamos for the explicit purpose of giving a lecture, Flying Saucers Are Real, to the American Nuclear Society chapter there. We had over 500 people, no negative questions. See, I could have done it under cover, technical discussions. You know, you can cover a lot of ground that way. I didn't. So the company was really good about that. And I appreciated the response there. Anyway, the reason I'm showing you the plaque here, the Condon report came out in 1969. And they had recommended that Project Blue Book be closed because it wasn't achieving anything of great significance. And I agree with that, as a matter of fact. So what they did was ask this guy, General Carroll H. Bollinger, who was working on a lunar excursion module at the time. Remember, we landed on the moon in 1969? I hope you all realize that we landed on the moon in 1969. And he was asked, he had no previous connection with Blue Book or UFOs or anything. And he wrote a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later, in which he said, moreover, reports of UFOs, which could affect national security, are made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. That's an extraordinary statement, because the Air Force had been saying for years, Blue Book was it. 2 paragraphs later, he says, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have any place to report sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Extraordinary claim. Now, I managed, as I say, it was 10 years before I saw a copy of this. One guy had done a Freedom of Information Act request for a bunch of stuff, and this was there, and he passed it around. I managed to locate General Bollinger and spoke with him. And I told him I'd had a clearance and so forth. I said, it sounds to me like you're saying that there are 2 separate communication channels for UFO reports. Those that could affect national security, and the example I used was, suppose a saucer flies down the runway at a Strategic Air Command base where nuclear weapons are stored. That's by definition a national security problem, because there ain't supposed to be anybody there besides people with clearances. Alternatively, if my wife and I are at the end of the driveway and we watch a flying saucer go overhead, no big deal, it happens all the time. And he agreed with me. And I've said this many times, and yet no major media publication has picked up on Bollinger's comment. Where are Woodward and Bernstein when you need them? The press has to do a better job. They did a good job on the political Watergate. How about the cosmic Watergate? He's dead now, incidentally. If any of you want to talk to him, you can. Well, maybe some of you do have connections on the other side. But I was very pleased to talk to him. And it makes sense. But it also means that the Air Force has been lying. They closed Project Blue Book as a result of that memo. That was October 1969. It was closed at the end of the year. And all those years since, they've said the Air Force has no interest, there's no security problem, or whatever. However, somebody, Lee Spiegel, Huffington Post, noted an Air Force regulation for pilots flying our top fighter planes. There's a little section in there, what to do if you see a flying saucer.
AFR 200-2.
And who to report it to. Well, they tried to get the Air Force to explain that, and the next time you look, that section wasn't in the regulation anymore. But that's very important that we've been lied to. I think it's important we've been lied to. I mean, I know some people say, well, people lie all the time, but it's supposed to be a democracy in which you have faith in your elected officials and that they tell the truth. You know, these old-fashioned notions, you know what I'm talking about. So I want to give evidence. Are there any media people here? One, okay. I was going to say, maybe you don't dare admit it here, but okay, two. I'll help you. But the failure of the press to follow up on the Bollinger memo, and I've been talking about it for years, is a significant failure. I can give anybody who wants it, I'll get you a copy. I didn't bring it with me, but I can get it from home, when I get there. So we're told that the Air Force, nobody's done anything since Blue Book was closed in 1969. And there's another part of this. Nobody ever talks about the Navy and flying saucers. Now, 3/4 of the planet's covered with water. The oldest and one of the best intelligence agencies is the ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence. It was funny, I tried to get some information from them. We don't have anything on flying saucers, I was told. Okay, then I got hold of a copy of a memo of a report that was written by Air Force Intelligence and Naval Intelligence. It says so. So I sent him a copy of it, the guy who told me they didn't have anything. Thank you very much for the interesting report. However, as I told you, we don't have anything. It wouldn't take anybody spending half of what Woodward and Bernstein spent on a political Watergate to blow the lid off the cosmic Watergate. Oh, I haven't told you that the proof that the government's withholding information, if you write the NSA, no such agency, National Security Agency, you can get copies of 156 top secret Umbra UFO documents. You can read one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out. You can get copies of dozens of CIA top secret Umbra documents. Everything's blacked out except a few words per page. Now, if you can't tell me you can't see under the black ink or the white ink in the other case, that means it's being covered up. It's being withheld. There's no way around it. So, it isn't that difficult for somebody to blast them out of the water. But of course, they have to admit that they had ignored this story for all this time. It's tough for the media to do that. And I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but you know that within 2 weeks of Pearl Harbor, that there was an Office of Censorship set up by the United States government? Less than 2 weeks later. What I want to know is whether they were ever closed. Incidentally, words like uranium couldn't be used by the press. The Japanese Fugo balloons, which were launched from, Pacific, and hoped would start fires across the forests of the United States because they had incendiary devices on them, big balloons and stuff. You couldn't publish anything that would tell anybody whether those were successful or not. Didn't want them to know. So there's a lot of other stuff that was censored, believe me. But, it is kind of strange. In 1952, there was a regulation for all military pilots. shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so. This was flying saucers we're talking about. 52 was the biggest year in Project Blue Book history. There were 200, I mean, I know, the cartoonists would have a field day with that. You know, how do you tell the alien, land, you know? I've talked to 7 different people who've quietly told me about being stationed at military bases where a guy went up after flying saucer, never came back. And if you read the New York Times, you will find record of 200 fatal military crashes of military aircraft between 1951 and 1956. 5 of them involved pilots who'd had over 100 missions in the Korean War, where there were MiGs trying to shoot them down. You had to be a pretty decent pilot to survive 100 missions, combat missions like that. Even the Times used words like disintegrated and disappeared with regard to a couple of these cases. In the course of my lecturing all over the place, I've talked to 7 different people who have heard such stories. And nothing in the press, other than plane lost at sea. And it's interesting that there's a book called By Any Means Necessary by a historian named William Burroughs. He's a journalist and a historian. 2001. He talks about 166 military aircraft personnel that died in planes that were, I love the expression, tickling the radar at North Korea, China, and Russia, mostly right after the war. They'd come in to see how quickly the radar came on, what frequency it was using, you know, that sort of stuff. And of course, the Russians were doing the same thing going the other way. Nothing was said to the families. Nothing was said in public. Burroughs wrote the book because in 2001, the military had a conference in which they called in the families and gave them the medals that their brother, son, whatever, had earned, and told them what had happened. And there was radio communication back from some of these planes because the engine is shot out. The plane's going down slowly, they're trying to get out. Many of them used parachutes and stuff. There hadn't been one story in public. I mention that because some people would have told me. Well, certainly they would have told the families. It is not true that at the time. And I did talk to one interesting case. The guy was scrambled. He was in a Navy plane in South Carolina. Late in the evening, he's on duty. The plane is parked out there, ready to be sent up. He gets scrambled, gets up. Where is it? Well, it's coming up towards you now. He sees it coming up. Coming toward him, puts his hand up. You can see the bones in his hand. It shines a bright light. What's he going to do? He's going to pull the trigger, shoot it down. I mean, that's what he's there for. If it's a threat to your security, and if he's coming at you like that, turns out the guns hadn't been loaded. So the UFO went by. He's talking to the guy on the radio, of course. And when he landed, he was talked to for a couple hours by a couple of suits and a couple of guys in uniform. And I've talked to him. We agreed that probably the only reason he was still alive was that the guns were unloaded. Strange world we live in. He wound up being a lawyer, incidentally. And for some people, maybe that's not a good recommendation. But so all this has been going on, you see. And we don't hear anything about it. But anybody, the Woodward Bernsteins would find out about a lot if you made an effort. You know, it's like America's Most Wanted. That's back on the air again, isn't it? Something like that. Where they're looking for criminals who've been convicted or whatever. They found a lot of criminals, because if people are listening, if you've made a real effort to get reports from former military pilots, and say at least 40 years old, 40 years back, something like that, you get loads of cases. And if you guaranteed anonymity. It was pretty hard for the government to punish somebody who very publicly goes with one of these stories, don't you think? What are you going to say? Well, it happened, but you're not supposed to say. That's admitting it happened, you know. Here's what he said, 2 parts. Moreover, reports of unidentified flying objects which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. However, as already stated, reports of UFOs which could affect national security would continue to be handled through the standard Air Force procedures designed for this purpose. That's pretty darn straightforward. And I know the guy is real because I talked to him. Now, one event among many that the press didn't cover. Hearings, you heard from Steve Massett yesterday, at the last hearings for Congress were in 1968, July 29th, my birthday. And it wasn't held that day because it was my birthday. Testimony from 12 scientists, 6 in person, 6 in writing. I was the youngest of the batch. I think I'm the only one still alive. And the only one without a PhD. The best paper was by Dr. James E. McDonald, a professor of physics at the University of Arizona. Outstanding, talked to 500 witnesses. His paper is 71 pages long. There's some copies back there. 41 outstanding cases. One of them, the RB-47 case, military reconnaissance plane flying over the Gulf of Mexico and then over Texas and up into Oklahoma, loaded with electronic gear. Daytime, they spot a UFO, they pick it up on their radar, it goes along with them, then circles around them, they radio the ground, military radar there picks up them and the crap. Lasted for over an hour. Jim talked to all 6 of the crew members. Outstanding case. Now, when I talked to Carl Sagan about this case, he said, oh, that was spoofing, Stan. That's where you create an artificial target on a radar screen electronically. I said, Carl, there were visual sightings. There were? Yes, Carl, there were. Oh, then it wasn't spoofing. I better think about that some more. Never heard any more from him about that. But see, it's a quick and easy answer, which was wrong. Flat out wrong. This is an excellent document. I believe it's actually on the internet. Everything almost is on the internet, you know. But the press coverage was minimal. As a matter of fact, the congressman who arranged for these hearings, it's the House Committee on Science and Astronomy, was gerrymandered out of his district in the next election. We take revenge on those who don't do what we want done, I guess. Now, Steve may be responsible for other hearings. I don't know. There's Jim. Super guy. In Gruffle, the women do an outstanding job in the field of ufology. How many of you were here yesterday? Wasn't Kathy Martin's paper extraordinary yesterday? And I'm not saying that just because we co-authored a couple of books. I thought it was a splendid. And Druffel here wrote the book about Jim. That one. Excellent book, highly recommended. Oh, then we come to the bad guys. Save the worst for the last? No, something like that. This is Philip J. Klass, trained in electrical engineering, spent most of his life as senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology, based in Washington. So he was a go-to man for the press because he was right there in Washington. And he explained every sighting. There was no sighting, he said, that didn't have a prosaic explanation. Now, how do you explain things? You lie, you misrepresent, you put forth hypotheses with no data to support them. Phil was very good at that. We've debated. I've said all these things and stronger in print, incidentally, so I'm not talking. He's deceased now. But I gave him a hard time when he was still alive, too. Some of you might have seen us on Nightline, I guess. With Ted Koppel. Yeah. And Phil was absolutely certain that there was no sighting that he couldn't explain. And if explanation number 1 doesn't work, you try explanation 2. And if that doesn't work, you try explanation 3. And don't bother me with the facts because my mind's made up. He made a big deal about plasmas, ionized air. That's what these things were. And Jim McDonald published a paper at a scientific meeting exploring Phil's explanation. Phil didn't know a damn thing about plasma physics. And he never considered the possibility that what people were seeing was an ionized air plasma, glowing region of air, around a craft. Now, you're all aware that that has an impact. When the Apollo command module comes back, we lose communication because it hits the atmosphere, it ionizes the air. Electrically conducting air doesn't let